the seeker stands before a fundamental paradox. Transformation is both inevitable and impossible. Nature demonstrates this truth with merciless clarity through the metamorphosis of the butterfly, yet humanity resists the very dissolution that precedes rebirth. The chrysalis represents more than biological curiosity. It embodies the central metaphysical problem that has occupied philosophers, alchemists, and depth psychologists for millennia. How does one die without dying? How does consciousness persist through radical transformation? These questions form the architectural foundation upon which all genuine esoteric work is constructed. The image of the chrysalis first entered Western philosophical consciousness not through entomology, but through the mystery traditions of ancient Greece, where the psyche, simultaneously meaning both butterfly and soul, became the symbol of metamorphosis itself. Heraclitus understood that the way up and the way down are one and the same, a doctrine that would echo through Hermetic philosophy, finding its fullest expression in the Emerald Tablet's famous axiom, "As above, so below." The Swiss alchemist Paracelsus would later articulate this principle with surgical precision, declaring that true medicine requires the physician to understand the correspondence between macrocosm and microcosm, between the transformations of matter and the transmutations of soul. Carl Gustav Jung, that most rigorous of modern alchemists, recognized in the medieval laboratory a projection of the psyche itself. His monumental work on alchemical symbolism revealed that the adepts were not merely engaged in chemical experimentation, but in a sophisticated psychological opus, the dissolution and reconstitution of consciousness itself. Eliphas Levi, standing at the threshold between Romanticism and modern occultism, insisted that magic is the science of the will, and that the chrysalis stage represents the supreme test of intentionality. Can the aspirant maintain coherent purpose while undergoing complete liquefaction of identity? The premise that governs all authentic esoteric work must be stated with absolute clarity. There is no external salvation, no alchemical gold that exists independently of the alchemist's transformation. The great work, the Magnum Opus, is fundamentally an interior enterprise. The fire that transmutes lead into gold is the same fire that burns away the false self, and the crucible is consciousness itself. Modern seekers who approach these teachings hoping for technique without transformation, for power without dissolution, have already failed to understand the most basic axiom of the path. You cannot emerge from the chrysalis as what you were before entering it. The alchemical tradition rests upon three fundamental principles: sulfur, mercury, and salt, which constitute not merely chemical substances, but metaphysical categories through which reality itself is organized. These principles represent the triune structure of all manifestation, echoing the Christian Trinity, the Neoplatonic triad of one intellect soul, and the Kabbalistic pillars of mercy, severity, and equilibrium. Sulfur embodies the fiery principle of consciousness and will, the active masculine force that initiates all transformation. Mercury represents the fluid, adaptive intelligence that mediates between extremes, neither wholly material nor fully spiritual. Salt constitutes the principle of fixation, the embodied wisdom that remains after the volatile elements have been purified. This tripartite structure finds its correlate in the Hermetic doctrine of the three bodies or vehicles of consciousness. The physical body, the soma, corresponds to salt, the fixed principle that grounds consciousness in material existence. The subtle body, the pneuma or astral form, aligns with Mercury, serving as the intermediary between matter and spirit. The causal body, the nous or divine intellect, resonates with Sulfur, representing pure consciousness, undifferentiated by form. The chrysalis stage involves the conscious negotiation between these three levels, a process that Jung would later map onto his psychology as the relationship between ego, personal unconscious, and collective unconscious. The connection to Kabbalistic thought becomes evident when we examine the Tree of Life as central pillar, the middle way between the extremes of force and form. The alchemical work proceeds along this middle path, neither denying matter through ascetic rejection nor drowning in materiality through hedonistic indulgence. The Sephira Tifere, representing beauty and balance, occupies this central position and corresponds to the heart center where the true self, Jung's Selbst, begins to coalesce from the raw materials of fragmented personality. The chrysalis is thus the Tiferet experience made manifest in biological terms, a complete dissolution of previous structure maintained in perfect equilibrium until the new form can emerge. Rosicrucian philosophy enriches this understanding by emphasizing the role of death and resurrection as literal stages in the alchemist's biography. Christian Rosenkreuz, the legendary founder, underwent his initiatory trials in a tomb, the ultimate chrysalis. The Rosicrucian chemical wedding details 7 days of transformation that mirror the 7 planetary metals and the 7 stages of alchemical refinement. This is not metaphor sanitized of power. This is precise cartography of consciousness under extreme conditions. The Rosicrucian adept understands that the chrysalis stage may last not hours or days but years, and that emergence cannot be forced without destroying the delicate internal structures being formed in darkness. The mentality required for this work differs fundamentally from ordinary consciousness. Aleister Crowley, despite his theatrical excesses, correctly identified that magical work demands what he termed true will, not the whims of the ego, but the deep intentionality of the self. This will must be cultivated through rigorous self-observation, through the systematic dismantling of self-deception, through what Gurdjieff called self-remembering. The occultist's ethics are not conventional morality, but something more demanding. Absolute honesty with oneself about one's actual state of being. Hypocrisy and self-flattery are the enemies that prevent transformation more effectively than any external opposition. The disposition toward doubt is equally crucial. The true adept maintains what Keats called negative capability, the capacity to exist in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without irritable reaching after fact and reason. In the chrysalis, all certainties dissolve. The question, "Who am I?" becomes not rhetorical, but devastating. Only those who can sustain this question without collapsing into either nihilistic despair or premature false solutions will complete the metamorphosis. This is why the teachings are protected not by secrecy, but by their own difficulty. The unprepared will simply abandon the work, while those with authentic vocation will persevere through the darkness. The alchemical opus proceeds through distinct phases, each representing both a chemical process and a psychological transformation. The sequence begins with Nigredo, the blackening, which corresponds to the initial stage of the chrysalis, where the caterpillar's body completely liquefies. Psychologically, this is the moment when the carefully constructed ego identity begins to dissolve under the pressure of genuine self-examination. The individual confronts the reality that much of what they believed about themselves constitutes elaborate fiction. Relationships that seemed solid reveal themselves as mutual projections. Careers pursued with conviction appear as desperate attempts to avoid deeper questions. Values proclaimed with confidence crumble when examined honestly. Jung understood Nigredo as the encounter with the shadow, those aspects of personality that consciousness has rejected and repressed. But this encounter is not the casual recognition that everyone has flaws. It is the devastating realization that the darkness one has attributed to others exists primarily within oneself. The racist discovers his own hatred. The moralizer confronts her own appetites. The intellectual meets his own stupidity. The spiritual seeker faces her own materialism. This stage cannot be abbreviated or sanitized. The alchemists depicted it as death, putrefaction, and descent into the underworld, because these images accurately capture the phenomenology of ego dissolution. In the chrysalis, this corresponds to the enzymatic breakdown of larval tissues. What was once a functioning organism becomes undifferentiated cellular soup. Nothing of the previous structure remains intact. The caterpillar cannot partially transform. Metamorphosis is total, or it fails entirely. Psychologically, this means that genuine transformation cannot preserve the ego's favorite aspects, while discarding only the inconvenient parts. The entire structure must be questioned. This is why Nigredo often manifests as depression in the clinical sense, a complete loss of meaning, purpose, and motivation. The difference between pathological depression and alchemical Nigredo lies in the intentionality brought to the experience and the larger context of transformation. The second phase, Albedo, the whitening, emerges gradually as new structures begin to form within the chrysalis. Where Nigredo dissolved boundaries, Albedo establishes new distinctions based on deeper truth. Jung associated this stage with the integration of the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of the psyche. The man must acknowledge and integrate his receptivity, intuition, and emotional depth. The woman must claim her authority, logic, and assertive power. This is not about gender stereotypes, but about the fundamental polarity that structures consciousness itself. In Albedo, the work becomes discriminative. The alchemist must separate the subtle from the gross, the essential from the accidental. This requires the development of what Gurdjieff called magnetic center, the capacity to recognize and value truth over comfort. The aspirant learns to distinguish genuine intuition from wishful thinking, authentic insight from intellectual cleverness, real presence from mechanical behavior. This discrimination happens not through abstract reasoning, but through direct observation of one's own psychological processes. The chrysalis at this stage begins showing faint outlines of the future form, though it remains impossibly fragile. Psychologically, Albedo often manifests as spiritual experiences, moments of clarity, sudden insights into the nature of reality. These experiences provide motivation to continue the work, but also present a serious danger: inflation. The ego, having been dissolved in Nigredo, can reconstitute itself around spiritual experiences, creating a spiritual ego even more defended than the original personality structure. The aspirant mistakes states for stages, temporary experiences for permanent attainment. True Albedo includes the humility to recognize that even profound insights remain partial and that the work is far from complete. The third major phase, Citrinitas, the yellowing, represents the solar consciousness beginning to emerge. The chrysalis now contains a recognizable butterfly, though still confined within the pupal case. This stage involves the integration of what Jung called the self, not the ego but the totality of the psyche, including both conscious and unconscious elements. The individual begins to experience moments of genuine wholeness when the fragmented aspects of personality align toward a unified purpose. This is the birth of what esoteric traditions call the higher self, or true will, not imposed from outside, but discovered as the deep structure of one's own being. Citrinitas involves the development of what alchemists called the subtle body, the psychological vehicle capable of functioning consciously at levels beyond ordinary awareness. In contemporary terms, this might be understood as the capacity for sustained metacognition, for observing one's own thought processes without identification, for maintaining awareness through various states of consciousness. The practitioner develops what Gurdjieff termed self-remembering, the ability to remain present to oneself, even while engaged in activity. This is not dissociation, but integration, not detachment, but fuller participation. The final stage, Rubedo, the reddening, represents the complete emergence from the chrysalis. The butterfly breaks free, but initially its wings are crumpled and useless. Blood must be pumped through the wing veins, expanding and hardening them before flight becomes possible. This corresponds to the phase Jung called individuation, the conscious realization of one's unique being within the larger collective. The individual has been transformed, but must now learn to function as this new entity. Old habits and patterns no longer serve. New capacities must be developed through practice. Rubedo is characterized by what the alchemists called the chemical wedding, the union of opposites within consciousness itself. Solar and lunar, active and receptive, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, achieve dynamic equilibrium. This is not the elimination of tension, but its transformation into creative polarity. The individual can now hold paradox without collapsing into one pole or the other. This capacity marks the transition from seeker to adept, from student to practitioner. The work shifts from self-transformation to service, from internal focus to external application of wisdom gained through the ordeal. Each of these stages contains within it the entire process in miniature. Nigredo moments recur throughout the work whenever a new level of self-deception is encountered. Albedo insights punctuate the ongoing practice. Citrinitas experiences provide encouragement during difficult passages. Rubedo integration happens gradually over years of sustained effort. The Chrysalis is not entered once, but many times, as each level of personality is systematically dissolved and reconstituted. The spiral nature of the path means that similar lessons return at deeper levels, requiring renewed commitment to the discipline of transformation. The moment of supreme crisis arrives when the aspirant realizes with complete clarity that the self they have been defending does not exist. This is not intellectual understanding, but visceral knowledge. The entire edifice of identity, memories, relationships, accomplishments, beliefs, values, reveals itself as an arbitrary construction, maintained through constant effort and ultimately destined for dissolution. The caterpillar's body has liquefied completely. There is no going back, yet the butterfly does not yet exist. Only the question remains, what am I in this moment between forms? This crisis stage corresponds to what mystics call the dark night of the soul, but that phrase has been so romanticized and misunderstood that it requires careful redefinition. This is not poetic melancholy or spiritual ennui. It is the complete collapse of meaning itself. The frameworks through which experience was organized, religious, philosophical, psychological, all fail simultaneously. Prayer brings no comfort because the one who would pray has dissolved. Meditation offers no peace because the meditator cannot locate himself to sit. Reason provides no answers because the questions themselves have lost coherence. Jung recognized this crisis as potentially psychotic, if not properly contained within a therapeutic or initiatory structure. The difference between a schizophrenic break and an alchemical Nigredo is primarily a matter of context and support. The schizophrenic experiences ego dissolution without a framework to understand or guide the process. The adept enters dissolution deliberately, supported by tradition, teacher, or practice. But the phenomenology, the actual experience, can be frighteningly similar. Voices, visions, paranoia, dissociation, the dissolution of boundaries between self and other, inner and outer, all these manifestations can occur in both pathological and transformative contexts. The philosophical distinction is crucial. Transformation requires a teleological context. The suffering must be oriented toward something, even if that something remains undefined. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The alchemist's why is the great work itself, the commitment to consciousness, to truth, to the transmutation of suffering into wisdom. Without this commitment, the crisis becomes merely pathological, a collapse into meaninglessness rather than a passage through meaninglessness toward new meaning. The specific character of this crisis varies according to the individual's psychological structure and dominant defense mechanisms. For the intellectual, it manifests as the complete failure of reason to provide certainty or security. All philosophical systems reveal themselves as elaborate rationalizations. Logic, which seemed to offer solid ground, becomes circular. The mind, which was the primary tool of understanding, is recognized as the primary source of delusion. For the emotional type, it appears as a profound loneliness, a recognition that no relationship can bridge the fundamental isolation of existence. Even the most intimate connections are revealed as partial, temporary, and ultimately incapable of providing the security the ego craves. For those whose identity centers on accomplishment and action, the crisis manifests as paralysis. Every possible action appears equally meaningless. Ambitions that once motivated tremendous effort now seem absurd. Goals achieved bring no satisfaction because the self who would be satisfied has dissolved. This is not laziness or depression in the clinical sense. It is the recognition that all worldly achievement amounts to rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. The ship is sinking because impermanence is built into the structure of existence itself. No amount of success can change this fundamental fact. The temptation at this stage is to retreat, to reconstitute the old personality structure, to declare the entire enterprise a mistake. Many aspirants abandon the path here, concluding that the old life, with all its compromises and illusions, was preferable to this devastating emptiness. They return to careers, relationships, beliefs, and entertainment, having touched the chrysalis stage, but refuse to complete the dissolution. This is not failure in the moral sense. Not everyone is called to complete transformation, but it does represent a turning away from the particular possibility that the crisis offers. Those who persevere must develop what the alchemists called fixation, the capacity to remain stable while everything dissolves. This is not done through will in the ordinary sense. The ego has no will at this stage, having recognized its own fictional nature. Rather, fixation occurs through surrender to the process itself, through trust in the intelligence that guides metamorphosis. The caterpillar does not consciously direct its transformation. It simply releases into the enzymatic dissolution. Similarly, the adept at this stage must release the compulsion to control the process intellectually or strategically. The crisis is resolved not by solving it, but by enduring it with complete presence. The ethical dimension of this crisis cannot be ignored. Conventional morality, based on reward and punishment, pleasure and pain, social approval and disapproval, becomes incoherent when the self who would receive rewards or punishments is recognized as illusory. Yet this does not lead to nihilistic amorality, but to what might be called metaphysical ethics, action arising from the nature of reality itself, rather than from ego-based calculation. The adept in crisis discovers that compassion emerges spontaneously when the boundaries between self and other soften, that right action flows from clarity of perception rather than from moral injunction. The butterfly emerges from the chrysalis, fundamentally transformed yet recognizably continuous with what entered. This paradox defines the final stage of the alchemical work. The philosopher is stone, the goal of the great work, is not a substance, but a state of consciousness characterized by stability, clarity, and creative potency. Jung called it the self, the totality of the psyche realized consciously. Eastern traditions name it various forms of enlightenment or awakening. The specific terminology matters less than the recognition that something genuinely new has been born through the ordeal. This new configuration of consciousness exhibits several distinctive characteristics. First is what might be called ontological security, a stability not dependent on external circumstances. The transformed individual does not require constant validation, achievement, or pleasure to maintain equilibrium. Like the butterfly's hardened exoskeleton, the personality structure has become resilient through the very process of breaking down and reforming. This security does not mean invulnerability to suffering, but rather a capacity to experience difficulty without fragmenting, to endure uncertainty without panic, to face death without terror. Second is perceptual clarity, the ability to see situations without the distorting lens of unconscious projection. Where previously all experience was filtered through ego defense mechanisms, the integrated individual perceives more directly. This does not mean perfect objectivity, which remains impossible for embodied consciousness, but rather awareness of one's own subjectivity and biases. The butterfly's compound eyes see the world differently than the caterpillar's simple eyes. Transformation involves not just personal change, but a fundamental shift in the mode of perception itself. Third is creative potency, the capacity to act effectively in alignment with one's deeper purpose. The alchemist spoke of the stone as having the power to transmute base metals into gold. Psychologically, this represents the ability to transform suffering into wisdom, conflict into growth, obstacles into opportunities. This is not Pollyanna optimism, but the hard-won capacity to work with reality as it is, rather than as ego wishes it to be. The transformed individual becomes what Gurdjieff called a generator rather than a consumer, someone who contributes energy to situations rather than merely extracting it. The ethical implications of this transformation are profound and demanding. Increased consciousness brings increased responsibility. The adept who has completed the great work cannot claim ignorance or innocence about the consequences of action. Greater clarity means greater accountability. This is why all authentic esoteric traditions emphasize service following attainment. The butterfly must fly. It cannot remain forever drying its wings. The gold produced by alchemical work must circulate. It cannot be hoarded without corrupting both the gold and the alchemist. For the modern individual, practical integration involves several specific commitments. First is ongoing practice. Transformation is not a one-time event, but a continuous process. The butterfly must exercise its wings daily, or they atrophy. The adept must maintain disciplines of meditation, self-examination, or contemplation that keep consciousness supple and prevent the reconsolidation of rigid ego structures. Second is authentic relationship. The transformed individual engages with others from presence rather than from persona, from reality rather than from role. This makes genuine intimacy possible, but also more demanding. Third is what might be called conscious participation in the world. The adept recognizes that personal transformation and collective transformation are not separate processes, but aspects of a single movement. Individual healing contributes to collective healing. Personal clarity supports cultural wisdom. This does not necessarily mean public teaching or visible leadership. The butterfly's contribution to the ecosystem is not primarily educational, but simply being what it is: pollinating, reproducing, participating in the food web. Similarly, the transformed individual's primary contribution may simply be functioning from greater consciousness, creating ripples of sanity in a largely unconscious world. The Hermetic school emphasizes that this level of integration cannot be achieved through casual study or weekend workshops. The work requires years of sustained effort, disciplined practice, and willingness to undergo repeated cycles of dissolution and reconstitution. Modern culture's demand for instant results and easy answers represents the very attitude that prevents authentic transformation. The chrysalis stage cannot be abbreviated. The butterfly cannot be extracted prematurely without destroying the delicate structures being formed in darkness. This is why genuine esoteric schools maintain rigorous standards and resist the temptation to popularize teachings in ways that strip them of transformative power. The final attainment might be described as conscious mortality, not denying death, but embracing it as the ultimate transformation. The butterfly lives only weeks or months, yet its brief existence manifests the complete realization of its nature. Similarly, the adept recognizes that death is not failure but fulfillment, the final metamorphosis through which individual consciousness returns to its source. This perspective does not make death less real, but renders it less terrifying, not the extinction of meaning, but its culmination. The gold produced by alchemical work is not destroyed by death, but revealed as having been eternal all along, temporarily mistaken for the mortal vessel that contained it. The chrysalis teaches what all sacred texts and secret doctrines have struggled to communicate. You must lose your life to gain it, die to be reborn, descend into darkness to discover light. The butterfly you seek to become already exists in the caterpillar's cells, dormant potential, awaiting only the courage to dissolve what you believe yourself to be. The fire that transforms is not external, but burns at the core of consciousness itself, and the gold that emerges is nothing less than awareness, recognizing its own indestructible nature. The great work is not accomplished by adding something new, but by removing everything false until only truth remains, radiant, weightless, and capable of flight.